Our second and final Newman lecture of the night will be Dr. Jesse Kraft talking about cash on the barrelhead, how hoards and shipwrecks have impacted colonial numismatics. Dr. Kraft is the American Numismatic Society Resolute Americana Assistant Curator of American Numismatics. What a mouthful. And he's been in that position since 2019. At the ANS, he focuses on coins, tokens, metals, and paper currencies of both North and South America. In 2021, he revived the Coinage of America's Conference, which we're thankful for. Dr. Kraft has been widely published on a number of topics, and we're very grateful for him to take time out of his schedule to come talk to us tonight about hoards and shipwrecks. Welcome, Dr. Kraft.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I appreciate it. My talk for this evening is called Cash on the Barrelhead, How Hoards and Shipwrecks Have Impacted Colonial Numismatics. Now, my title is a phrase of speech. Cash on the barrelhead is money that you literally have and are ready to put out on the barrelhead to pay. It's not credit. It's not barter. It's actually money that you're willing to hand out. Now, of course, cash on the barrelhead is spelled C-A-S-H, but I, made a little pun out of it and put cash on the barrelhead, C-A-C-H-E, which of course is a hoard or a group of money that is now able to be studied because it's been lost or any which way. So, little pun for us in my talk. So again, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Wayne, for that wonderful talk beforehand. I appreciate it. So what is a hoard? What is a shipwreck? A hoard is a stock or store of money of valued objects. It's usually one that has been put in a secret place or is heavily guarded, one that is basically lost over time for the most part. This is different than a collection, which is generally collected for its numismatic values often, whereas a hoard is a savings of some sort. It's actually money that is being used at that time and then collected as a savings and then for whatever reason is lost. Because it's different than a collection, numismatists really should be aware of this, the difference between a hoard and a collection. You can get very different information out of it. We'll go over both during the course of my talk. In American contexts, hoards can be buried, but are more often stashed in places. A lot of the hoards that we talk about, as opposed to ancient numismatics, which are often buried in archaeological contexts, in the American context, they're often stashed sometimes in floorboards or behind walls, or as we'll see, behind mantelplaces even. A shipwreck. What is a shipwreck? Well, a ship that is sunk, basically. But when we talk about shipwrecks, we often talk about the treasures that are found within them. So when we talk about a shipwreck, we're talking really more about a shipwreck find than anything else. And the contents, of course, are of importance. It's not of course, the shipwreck is important, and we can glean a lot of information from it. But as a numismatist, it's really the finds, the coins that are of importance. Both shipwrecks and oftentimes hoards are unintentionally lost. That's how we find them. Usually, people don't intentionally lose things and then die. It's something that is unintentional, and oftentimes they're extremely difficult to recover. Even if we know the precise location of a shipwreck, it might take sometimes centuries to actually recover, as we'll see. Those are the two different two differences between what I'm going to talk about. But there's a different kind of side of this with archaeology. Archaeology, what are the benefits of archaeology? Well, it complements the written record. So oftentimes with American numismatists, we focus on records, statistical analyses, and archival stuff like that. With archaeology, we're able to complement that. So that's where it finds its importance. It allows oftentimes for new questions to be asked even, can dispel earlier truths. Unfortunately, in numismatics, sometimes theories have been devised in the 19th century and they stick around up to the present day, and we consider them numismatic truths when that's not the case. And oftentimes hoards and collections that are found can dispel those truths. Of course, it's important for us to be logically minded and not infer anything that is unreasonable, any unreasonable inferences. So archaeology puts a timestamp on things, as we'll see. Once we know that something has been buried in the ground for, say, 3 centuries, we can date it back to that 3 centuries. As Wayne showed us in our previous talk, things get buried and are lost there, and it provides a record for us, and we know that things circulated at a given time. So archaeology helps us recognize that. As numismatists, it allows for better understanding of circulation patterns. Again, Wayne showed us that things that we wouldn't think ever circulated, like early 17th century British tiny farthings. I mean, we have evidence, we have proof that they were here, and it's thanks to archaeology. And this is, it shows both local and international patterns. So it's really, really intriguing what you can find. And as I'll show you as well, archaeology can show what is both quote unquote real and what is both not necessarily real. And I'm not necessarily talking about whether or not the objects within a given hoard are real, but also whether or not the hoard itself is real, because as we've shown, sometimes hoards can be misconstrued as collections, and they're not. And different historical kind of analyses can be drawn from that. So here's a short list of hoards and shipwrecks that I'll be talking about today. I'm not going to go into detail about any of them, so it looks like a long list. It looks like we'll be here all night, but that's not necessarily the case. I'll give a brief introduction about each of them, and then kind of give some historical conclusions that people have drawn from these finds. So Jamestown, Castine, Feversham, the Cornell hoard, Bank of New York hoard, the great Fujio copper find, Stepney, Solitude, and Cohen. So I'll first start with historic Jamestown. It's an extremely important site. It's situated not too far from Colonial Williamsburg, of course. It's different from Colonial Williamsburg, whereas Williamsburg has both archaeological finds as well as an amazing numismatic collection that's been collected as a collection and then donated to them. What you'll find at historic Jamestown is mostly archaeological finds. So again, archaeology allows for a better understanding of monetary circumstances. With Jamestown, we're talking about some of the earliest settlers of what is now the United States. So we're talking about the very early 17th century. And thousands, I have thousands, but it's probably about 1,000 numismatic objects have been found in an archaeological context there, including hundreds of coins. We're talking about Irish, English, Spanish, Dutch, and then also coins from Santo Domingo, the Baltic region, notably Riga, which is now in Latvia, and then also Venetian coins. So, it shows a really good context of the various coins that circulated there. In addition to that, we have the list I have actually has exactly 500 Nuremberg jetons have been found, and that's those on the lower right. And we can actually, there's almost 2 kind of historical stories going on here, because Nuremberg jetons are known to have circulated in the London area, so they could have been very easily imported with the English settlers. But most people don't realize that actually the majority of people who came over and settled in what is now historic Jamestown were actually German people. So people from the Nuremberg area actually came as well. We also have these King's Touch tokens. A lot of people might not recognize what they are, but they were actually admission tokens, and you could use these to essentially pay and meet King James and essentially be blessed by him in London in the late 16th century. And they were brought over in historical Jamestown context and used as money. We find them, obviously you can't come to Jamestown and be blessed by King James because he was over in London, but they could be brought over to Jamestown and used as money. And that's what exactly was happening. To date, no gold coins have been found in Jamestown, but 21 gold weights have been found. Some people suggest that this might mean that gold actually circulated there. I don't necessarily know that if gold actually circulated there. I think it's more like they hoped that gold was circulating there when they arrived, so they brought gold weights with them. I mentioned Santo Domingo. Here's one of two that was found, like as it was being found. It's actually the oldest New World coinage found. I have in an English colony, but it's really a non-Spanish colony. So even if you include the French and Old New York, I mean, this is literally the oldest New World coin that you will find outside of what was New Spain, et cetera. So super historical find. You might infer that these early colonists were trading with that part of the world, but that's not true because dozens of these have actually been found in England. So we know that they circulated in England probably before they came here. So it's not necessarily a sign of early trade with Santo Domingo, but that the English colonists were bringing those with them. This is 2 of 5 Spanish American coins that have been found in Jamestown, and the others are like 1 real coins of Philip II. What else can we find from historic Jamestown? Over 17,000 pieces of this scrap copper have been found. And it might not seem historically significant, but we know that it was used for trade with the Native Americans. So it actually is extremely monetarily important for the early economy of historic Jamestown and Virginia as a whole. Here we have a small example when Captain John Smith traded 25 pounds of copper and 50 pounds of mostly iron for a whole bunch of food that can feed 40 men for 6 weeks. And these were all found in a 1607 to 1617 context. Now you might say, how's, we already talked about, its monetary aspects, but are there any other numismatic inferences we can draw from this? And then they find this piece, which is extremely, extremely interesting. It's actually two pattern coins, actually. They were using roller presses at the time. So they're like cylindrical dies that you can essentially just crank out. And that's what these were. These coins were never issued for circulation. This is some of the only representations we have of them. They were struck on quote unquote scrap copper and then cut so they wouldn't be used as money, as to be cut out and used as money. But it shows, if we study this and then study all the other 17,000 pieces of scrap copper that were found, it shows that they all were coming actually from the Royal Mint. And the Royal Mint was possibly the source for all of the scrap copper, most likely used from a 1601 to 1602 production of Irish coins at the Royal Mint, but then also, of course, this 1601 experimental issue. So of extreme importance. It provides new understanding of Royal Mint practices, their role in the early American colonies, as well as how the early colonists interacted with the native population. So an extremely interesting piece that wouldn't otherwise necessarily be known. Move on to the Castine hoard. I'm going to kind of jump around to these different hoards pretty quickly, so there's no interlude between them per se. The Castine hoard, of course, from Castine, Maine. This is a very famous hoard of colonial coins, perhaps the most famous hoard that was ever found. It was found by Captain Steve Grindle and his son in 1840. The hoard is thought to be from the late 1600s, as late as May of 1704. That's probably an accurate date. This is Mr. Castine here. He had actually fled from the English back to France, and it's thought that his daughter had actually buried the coins around May of 1704, and then was actually caught by the English just hours thereafter. So it was a close call that they weren't buried, and then they wouldn't have been understood by numismatists today. The last coin dated was 1690. There's in between 500 and 2,000 coins found, so pretty significant find. The exact contents are unknown because, unfortunately, the Grindles had some bills to pay, sold the coins, and the vast majority of them were melted for their silver content. We do know that there were a few dozen pieces of Massachusetts silver in there, as well as coins from England, France, Spain. It's both the Metropole and Colonial, Holland, and Brazil. This is a very famous picture of the coins, some of the coins that were saved from the melting pot of the Castine hoard. We know that a Dr. Stevens purchased 17 coins, a Mr. Williamson purchased 5 more. All of those coins are now in the Maine Historical Society. Situations similar to that probably occurred because there are other coins that occasionally pop up in the marketplace that have the Castine provenance. Whether we don't know if that's actually, if they actually came from that, but they claim to be. So this picture actually caught the imagination of Sidney Noe, who is a famous numismatist. Everyone here probably knows his name from his book on Massachusetts silver, his books, I should say. This picture that I showed before captured his imagination, and he wanted to kind of understand it better. So in 1941-42, he gathered about 500 pieces of Massachusetts silver, as well as many other coins that were representative of that image, and held a pretty big exhibition at the ANS. I wrote an article about this in Gene last year, and that really explicates what's going on. But if it weren't for the Castine hoard and it capturing Noe's imagination, we really wouldn't have a better understanding of Massachusetts silver. Maybe Chris Salmon still would have read his book and stuff like that. But it really kind of put it into the popular imagination of numismatics as we know it. So he also wrote another book at the same time called The Castine Deposit, an American Hoard. But as far as numismatics goes, it really helped catapult the understanding of Massachusetts silver. Mike, this one's for you. The Castine hoard also had one contemporary counterfeit that we have here on the left. We wouldn't understand that it was a contemporary counterfeit had it not been in this context from this early 18th century. And from that, of course, Mike Brooks actually discovered in 2017 this piece verified by Ray Williams, that it actually another contemporary counterfeit exists that shares a reverse die. Without this, Massachusetts silver has long been counterfeited. I mean, people were counterfeiting this stuff in even the late 18th century. So some things that have been thought of as contemporary counterfeits are even not contemporary, or in 100 years after the fact. So without this piece having been found on the Castine hoard, we wouldn't know that either of those are actually contemporary counterfeits. So it's helped understand further our understanding of contemporaries as well. So extremely important piece. The HMS Feversham is a 32-gun fifth rate built in Shoreham in 1695. So that means it's the second smallest ship. So not a huge galleon or something like that, rather small ship. But its primary assignment was to help protect trade, both in England and along the North Atlantic coast. At one point, it was detached to go to Queen Anne's War up in Quebec, in Big Quebec. At the time when it was discharged for this, it was actually New York City, and its primary objective in New York City was to gather money because it was just down in the West Indies and spent all its money. So it's in New York, gets more money, and then is told to go up to Quebec. Unfortunately, what they didn't find out, they left, and then the very next day they get news, or they don't get news, that they're not supposed to go to Quebec because they left the day before. So they weren't actually supposed to be where they were. Unfortunately, they ran aground and sank with about 600 pounds sterling of silver off of Cape Breton Island in 1711. This is an image of Cape Breton Island. There's actually video footage because it wasn't found until 1984, and it was pretty rocky as this. So I don't necessarily, I'm not surprised that it sank, but it was pretty rocky coast. But what can we find from the Feversham? What was found was known as a merchant's hoard. It was not like a personal savings. It was something that was gathered and intended to be spent in various locations, as a merchant would. There were Massachusetts silver, quite a bit of Massachusetts silver, as well as Dutch line dollars, Spanish American silver of most denominations, as well as some British coins. Again, 126 pieces of Massachusetts silver of all the different types. You have New England type, willow, oak, and both types of pine tree on there. It's extremely important because it shows as late as the early 18th century that all types of Massachusetts silver is still in circulation. It's kind of an amazing hoard. It wasn't a collection as such, it's stuff that was actually meant to be spent. So it's pretty cool in my opinion. And also it shows that this stuff was able to be paid out not only this late, but in various colonies. You know, it wasn't necessarily localized to Massachusetts, even though Massachusetts would have liked that to be. So what else can we find about the Feversham? Cuts Massachusetts silver. There's quite a few pieces of cut Massachusetts silver aboard. There were examples of cut Massachusetts silver known before this, but we weren't quite sure of its context. We weren't sure if it was actually for monetary purposes. It could have been done centuries later by people, you know, hoping that it was. But this, knowing that it went down in 1711, again, it puts that timestamp on there. We know that this was used in a monetary context in the early 18th century and most likely before. And interestingly enough, I mean, on the Feversham as well, they found sixpence and you know, other small denominations, but despite that, they were still cutting this stuff. In total, 9 pieces of cut silver was found. The ANS has 3 of them. The piece on the right is a pine tree. You can actually see the pine, but the 2 on the left are actually oak trees. So it's pretty interesting that cut oak trees were circulating decades after they were struck, presumably cut, and in a completely different colony than where they were issued. So moving on to the Cornell hoard, obviously paper currency. This one is in Colonial Williamsburg. It's an accumulation formed by Samuel Cornell, who is a merchant, possibly a currency speculator at the same time, originally from New York City, but moved to New Bern, North Carolina, which is on Roanoke Island. I think it's the northern city, the other being Wanchese on Roanoke Island. As a loyalist, Mr. Cornell fled from this location back to London, but later then went to British-occupied New York, where he brought his large hoard with him. It amounted to 7,000 pounds sterling, dated between 1748 and 75. You know, it's really interesting because a lot of the times we hear of these early colonial pieces and, you know, them being printed on crappy paper, wearing out, you know, ripping over short amounts of time. This showed that paper currency actually could circulate for decades and did circulate for decades. You know, this wasn't a collector. This was someone who gathered this material with the intent to spend it. And I believe this is only half the hoard. Is that correct, Eric?
It's speculative, but yeah, it's probably about half.
Yeah, so imagine double that, and you know, it's a lot of dough.
You know how many notes?
I don't know how many notes. Probably a few dozen, we'll say.
And where were they?
I'm not sure exactly where they found. Eric, do you know any more about this?
I do. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah. The Bank of New York hoard. So now we're moving along in colonial history. 1788, a keg of 5,000 Fujio cents are deposited into the Bank of New York. It's kind of quote unquote forgotten for quite a while. By 1859, tellers at the Bank of New York find it and begin distributing it to their favorite clientele and to numismatists who ask about it. By 1948, Damon Douglas examines them, and there are only 1,641 pieces left. By 98, Tony Terranova gets to them. There's only 712. This is actually the keg that they were found in. Tony was gracious enough to donate it to the ANS in 2011. There's, you know, us numismatists, we love really, really small details. So with this hoard, we didn't find, you know, some great circulation pattern or something like that. But he did weigh them all, and I think actually Damon Douglas weighed them all and found that there are actually 2 different weight standards happening here. So, you know, us numismatists loving the fine details, you know, it tells something about the production process. So, you know, it's interesting where, you know, this is something that you can only really find in a hoard in this degree. You know, if you're weighing individual pieces, you might recognize it over a 30-year period, but hoards really give you the opportunity to study a lot of pieces all at once. And with that, recognize something like this almost immediately. And that's, you know, how a lot of articles written in either C4 or Gene, you know, come to be, is because of kind of these amazing details that are found from hoards and other groups of coins. Moving on to the Great Fujio copper find. This is kind of the other end of the Fujio story goes. There's several stories. I kind of have two stories here. One has been in numismatic lore, therefore it's been numismatic quote unquote fact for a long time, where 14-year-old Seavillis Betts, I don't know if anyone knows anything about him, located a site in New Haven where Fujios were supposedly struck. He supposedly restruck several in brass, gold, silver, and copper. There's another story where Horatio Rust, and he could be even a third person in the story. What's the name? Ross, right? Rust, yeah. He traveled to New Haven and searched for information, and there supposedly found that a company called Broom and Platts were striking the coins. We still don't know the story, to be honest with you. Julia Casey even wrote another article about S.C. Kingman, who possibly borrowed the dies and struck more. So there, potentially as many as 5 people, I think, are involved with this. And, personally, I think there might even be 2 sets of dies struck, engraved at 2 different times. But anyway, that's a lot of detail for this. But more than likely, Scoville Mint struck dies. And again, I think that there's even references to restrike dies that go back to the 1830s, 1839. So I really think that there's more to the story. That said, these coins didn't necessarily fool people for long. I mean, it was this great hoard that was supposedly found, but by 1860, people are saying, that's probably not a hoard from the 1780s. It's possibly manufactured new dies even. So this is one of those stories where, it's important as numismatists to kind of have a level head, look at what you see with, some sorts of just finding truth rather than coming across a hoard of coins and then thinking of the most fanciful things in the world. Others were fooled, however. In 1873, the AJN recounted the story of their great discovery and that they were actually restrikes and not struck from newly minted dies. They're in the Red Book today. There's many other late 19th century delicacies that didn't make it into the Red Book, but for whatever reason, because these caught the imagination of numismatists rather early through this great hoard, they're still listed in the Red Book when maybe they shouldn't be. Now considered to be, according to Dave Bowers, quote unquote, one of the most famous numismatic hoaxes. So fortunately, we saw through it. But of course, these still have an impact on our hobby. The ANS does have 3 of the dies here, 3 of the dies. I know that one of them is in a historical society up in Connecticut. I'm not sure if the others are known exactly where they are. The Stepney hoard is another hoard that's kind of shrouded in doubt. Unlike the great Fujio copper find, this one actually contains real coins, but is it a real hoard? So that's kind of the question. Supposedly a hoard from circa 1788 from Connecticut, roughly 200 AU plus MS coins, something that we would all love to have, but can we actually infer, the actual information of it being a hoard from this? Breen surmised that it was possibly from that period based on the latest date and also wear pattern. And despite the fact that these were supposedly found in a quote unquote antique iron kettle in Stepney, Connecticut, the precise location was never given. So we don't really know, where they were found. They could have been in an iron kettle for decades, but are they an actual hoard? We don't quite know. But again, this is a reminder that numismatists, archaeologists must determine whether a cache of coins are an actual legitimate deposit or whether they're accumulated later on and then claimed to be a hoard. So the Solitude hoard is another interesting one. It didn't consist of a lot of coins. It didn't consist of high grade coins, but as numismatists, it told us something, and it's something that we, still kind of base our understanding about where these coins were made of. And it kind of starts with this hoard. Solitude was the residence of a New Jersey Supreme Court justice. It happens to be the same residence that Walter Mould fled to essentially after his falling out with Goadsby and Cox. Julia, I think you wrote the article where Mould was essentially convicted of counterfeiting. Once he came to America, it's like a dozen years later, this article that was originally published in London is reprinted in New Jersey, and it kind of probably raises awareness to Goadsby and Cox that Mould was convicted of counterfeiting in years past. So they tried to separate themselves. He flees to Solitude and strikes his coins there. Eventually, in 1925, a small hoard of coppers are found behind a mantelpiece in Solitude. In 1964, there's only about 17 of them left. So again, not too many. They're not high grade. They're not, it's not the most seemingly important hoard on the surface. But again, the fact that they were found in the exact place where these coins are struck is kind of telling. So in 1964, Sipsey examined 17 of them. 8 of them are the large planted types. From that, he surmises that all of the Maris 59Os to 67 Vs were definitively struck there, and all of the large planchet types were also definitively struck there. And we'd still base our understanding of that based off of this hoard. So it's pretty important numismatically. Again, it doesn't tell about large circulation patterns or anything, large amounts of gold. I mean, no one got, immensely rich off of this like several other hoards. But as numismatists, it has told us something interesting about those specific coins. This is the last hoard I want to talk about, the Colonel M.I. Cohen hoard. The 1773 Virginia halfpennies were famously struck in that year, but not released in Virginia for another 2 years. So a lot of those were hoarded, not necessarily released into circulation immediately. So they're actually one of the most common types of colonial coins that are available in high grade, as many of us know. Mr. Cohen has at least 2,200 of these in absolutely pristine condition. They remained practically intact until 1929 and not really fully disposed of until the 1950s. So it gave us a lot of time as numismatists to study the hoard as a whole. This is something that, I didn't do a die study analysis of this, but I did find that it's been noted that 20 different die pairings have been found in this one hoard. Now, I found that interesting, and then I did a little bit of analysis myself on this. That's just 110 coins per variety, which isn't a lot. Now, if this is a cask or a keg that was filled as these coins were being produced, which is to be surmised, I mean, I don't think that anyone was going from keg to keg and picking a few out and then filling up this one keg. It shows that these coins are actually mass produced all at one time, that there's more than likely several presses running all at once. It wasn't, a one press operation. So we wouldn't necessarily even have that thought in our minds if it weren't for this hoard that was found, this one single keg. So, it's kind of, little questions like that we're able to ask ourselves as numismatists from hoards, from shipwrecks, from large accumulations that we know have that timestamp and haven't been touched in centuries sometimes. This piece here is probably the finest known. It's an MS67 PCGS, an absolutely beautiful coin. It's as good as it gets, really. So, in conclusion, hoards and shipwrecks that contain colonial pieces, of course, are of extreme importance. I mean, yes, they're sometimes glittering with gold and silver, but as numismatists, as historians, as archaeologists, we really do learn a lot more than just that simple wealth that's brought up. Some answers are purely numismatic, as I've seen. Others are larger cultural trends, economic trends, social trends. There's also the opportunity for cross-collaboration between everyone, numismatists, historians, archaeologists, and that's really how we get the best understanding is when, we ask questions among people, whose interests overlap but aren't the same. We often don't use the same, tools for understanding. So cross collaboration is of extreme importance. And of course, it's always important to remember that not every hoard is actually a hoard. Some of them are collections. So just be wary if you come across a quote unquote hoard. So thank you.
Maybe you want to address the one that was out. I'm sorry, what was the question?
Something paper.
Currency, where was the
Okay, Colonial board made with Cornell stairs until about 1911. Then notes and some of the papers made families attempts to reclaim their father was loyalists. So his property was confiscated by the United States during the Revolution, and all of their paperwork relating to their attempts at reclamation of their father's property were all in a chest. And the whole archive was given to the New York Public Library. New York Public Library was very interested in the letters and documents, didn't give a hoot about the paper money. So the paper money was deaccessioned by them and sold off to a numismatic entity I must not name in the 1960s or 70s. The numismatic entity was twofold. One part kept his portion of the collection intact, and that went to Colonial Williamsburg. The other portion is all the stuff that's at auction and in dealers' inventories today. So that's why we say half of the hoard is at Colonial Williamsburg. The other half has been dispersed and is probably in the collection. Everybody in this room. So,
Any other questions? Roger?
There's always been a tension between metal detectorists, who we just heard from, and museums and other institutions that are academic, even to the point that we found out when we wanted to donate some of the I-95 material to some museums, they outright refused to say these were not found by archaeologists and excavated in a proper manner. And yet we've heard from Wayne that 50% of the coins he has found would not have ever been found because walls have been built over them. So I'm wondering, I know that all museums don't have that philosophy, but many of them do, and I guess there's a museum group. What's your feeling about that? I mean,
It's definitely a gray area. At the ANS, we have a lot of archaeologists there. I'm the only historian, so I do come at this a little bit differently. I'm also the only modernist there. So, a lot of the tensions between classically trained archaeologists and really almost American numismatists, that's kind of where the tension derives from. I'm not necessarily in that. I understand, as Wayne showed, that many things would be completely lost. I do think that's a completely different situation than going to an archaeological site in Turkey and raiding it in the middle of the night. That's a different situation. That does happen, and that's where a lot of hoards that are found there and then, left the country are legitimately looted. A lot of the places where, like, say, Wayne hunts will never, ever, ever be archaeological sites. So there is a difference there. I understand that it is a gray area. I blame Chris for giving me this topic and having to field this question. But it is something that we have to deal with. And I wouldn't recommend Wayne to go to historic Jamestown and start, metal detecting there. That would be uncouth, and I think that Wayne would think that as well. But at the same time, going in the middle of the woods and finding places that no one will ever find, that's something that has clear benefit in it, and something that we will hopefully continue to learn from.
Dennis, a question.
What was the contemporary counterfeit at Castine?
I'm sorry?
What was the contemporary counterfeit ID? In the Castine hoard, there was one contemporary counterfeit. I couldn't read it on the screen.
Well,
The 10X actually is the 10X, yeah.
And the 12S is unique, it's not a counterfeit.
Yeah, the 10X is unique. It is a counterfeit. And then the 11X, which was the 2017 discovery, is also unique and is also a counterfeit. So,
The Jamestown scrap copper you described.
Yeah.
Are the weights of the pieces random, or have they been trimmed to certain, close to standards either?
it's completely random. I mean, that's why I really am hesitant to call it numismatic, because I mean, that's kind of the defining factor between like, random pieces of silver and hack silver and coins. I mean, it is kind of, finding a common weight standard.
You didn't find them in a workshop where it'd be the scrap of a craftsperson.
Right. Yeah. These were found in a monetary context. So yeah.
Right. So it
Yeah.
makes sense to consider them monetary.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's what I was wondering, is the weight.
Right. Yeah. And unfortunately, no weight standard. Definitely not a craftsperson's waste. They were definitely found in monetary context, but I wouldn't call them coins by any means. Yeah.
If you see the museum question, you'll probably hate wading into this one. The Stephanie board.
Yes.
So based on like the Colonial board and the Bank of New York board, we have, for example, the Stephanie board, we have one example of a lot of rides.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So in your mind, is this a hoard or is this a collection?
It's a collection.
That,
Yeah.
Somebody inherited and didn't want to some of the other heirs about it or something.
Right. I think it's a collection. That's a collection is more sexy when it becomes a hoard, right?
Yeah.
So you can create this 200-year-old story to it. That said, it's a collection that all of us in here would love to have. Beautiful coins. Era coins that are pushing mid-level MS grades and stuff like that. So, it's not a hoard. It's been, viewed as a hoard for decades, but yeah, we shouldn't call it that. So this is really why I added it as an example of something that's a hoard, but really isn't.
Then my follow-up question on that is the grade level of every coin in here. I have to say, I think there was one that was like an X point that was green, so it could have been
Right.
That grade level suggests that these were either taken from circulation or stayed very close to the time they were minted,
Right.
which pushes our idea of coin collectors noticing different die varieties back quite a bit.
Oh yeah.
Well before minting, somebody else seeing this stuff. So all these should be collecting Connecticut.
And this actually, the vast majority in the Stepney Hoard were Connecticut's. This isn't. This is a Machen's Mills. So it goes to show you that, it very well could be a collector who knew what they were talking about and not necessarily something that was, pulled from circulation per se. Although, as you say, it was gathered, most likely gathered, around that time, but who knows the true story with it. It's just, again, sexier to call it a hoard. So he did.
I want to thank you, Dr. Kraft, very much. Take a picture of us. So excellent. Thank you so much.
You both need to be in the light.